I am Stella, 33 years old, and for 7 years, I played the perfect daughter-in-law in a family that never saw me as enough. I worked full-time as a graphic designer, handled the emotional labor of the Caldwell household, and smiled through dinners where every compliment was a backhanded insult. From the very beginning, Elias's mother Patricia made it clear I was not what she pictured for her only son. "At least she is polite," she once muttered during a brunch with the neighbors, as if I were some kind of rescue pet Elias had brought home. His sister Claire was worse, cold, calculating, and always performing for attention. She would slip comments like Stella's from the working class, no family legacy there. Elias would just sip his wine as if he did not hear. I convinced myself for years that their silence was neutrality, not approval of the cruelty. But the truth was simpler and uglier. They did not want me to belong. I was convenient, quiet, and expendable. I remember standing in their grand living room one Christmas, holding a gift I had spent hours making for his father, hand-drawn illustrations of their family crest, framed in walnut, and watching him hand it to Claire and say, "You always know just what I like." Claire had not even wrapped it. My name was not mentioned once, not even a thank you. I stood there smiling, heart splitting quietly in two. And Elias, he did not say a word. Not then, not ever. I was tolerated, not loved. Displayed, not valued. I thought marriage meant partnership, but in their world, it meant silence. And the more I bent, the more they pushed. I began to wonder if they wanted to break me, just to prove they could. I started documenting it all quietly, meticulously. Not just for my sanity, but for the day I would stop smiling and start walking. And when that day came, it would not be with tears. It would be with strategy. Because nothing fuels a woman's quiet revenge more than years of being underestimated. If they thought I was disposable, they had no idea what I would become once I stopped trying to fit into their perfect little frame. They would learn the hard way: when I disappear, I do not return the same. The day of the family barbecue started like every other forced social gathering in the Caldwell household, me arranging platters, lighting citronella candles, and trying not to breathe too loud. Elias, as always, disappeared into conversations with his cousins, while I played hostess to people who still asked if I was the assistant or the wife. Claire arrived fashionably late in a white linen dress that probably cost more than our kitchen renovation. She strutted through the backyard like she owned the land under her heels, tossing air kisses and casual insults like she was auditioning for some twisted reality show. I tried to keep my distance, focusing on the grill and praying the burgers would distract me. But Claire never let me off that easily. She waited until everyone was seated, red wine in hand, and then delivered the line that would break me. "You know," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "if Stella disappeared tomorrow, I do not think anyone would even notice." Laughter. Real, echoing laughter. Elias chuckled. His father shook his head, like it was just harmless fun. Patricia smirked behind her wineglass. I stood, frozen spatula in hand, heat rising in my chest, not from the grill, but from 7 years of silent humiliation. I looked directly at Claire, then slowly lifted my glass. "Try me," I said, calm and clear. The table went quiet for a second, maybe two. But the moment passed like all the others. They moved on. They always did. I, however, did not. That night, while Elias slept beside me, like a man with no conscience, I made a plan. I packed quietly, deliberately. I left the ring on the nightstand and took only what was mine. But I also left something else: a letter printed and taped to the fridge, quoting Claire's words from that afternoon. At the bottom, I wrote, "Now you will all know what it feels like to miss someone who mattered." I left without tears, without guilt, just fire. I did not tell Elias where I was going. He did not deserve to know, because for the first time in years, I was not shrinking to fit into their world. I was reclaiming my own. They would call, they would email, they would search, but I would be gone. Not broken, not lost, just done. And somewhere far from their gated perfection, I would begin again, louder, brighter, and unbothered. If you have ever been humiliated by people who should have protected you, tell me your story below. And do not forget to comment, like, and subscribe so I can keep telling stories that help us all heal. The letter I left taped to the fridge stayed in my mind as I sat in the back of a rideshare car, watching their world shrink in the rearview mirror. Claire's words still rang in my ears. If I disappeared tomorrow, no one would notice, and I carried that venom like fuel. My phone buzzed 5 times before I turned it off completely. Elias was predictable, and I knew exactly how it would unfold: a few missed calls, a passive-aggressive email, then radio silence as if pretending I never existed would help him save face. That suited me fine. I did not want closure, I wanted distance. I rented a small studio in Portland with a leaky faucet and peeling paint, but it was quiet mine and entirely outside the shadow of the Caldwell name. For the first week, I barely spoke. I walked the streets with my hoodie pulled low, letting the air clear the rot from my lungs. I worked freelance gigs, redesigned my portfolio, and made a new email, one that did not include Caldwell. There was something sacred in erasing their name from my life. I blocked Elias, Claire, Patricia, and every acquaintance who had ever called me the outsider who married up. At night, I wrote everything down, not to publish, not to post, but to document. Not a diary, but a ledger. I listed every insult, every dismissal, every time I was looked through instead of looked at. Then I flipped the page and started a new list: goals. One of them was to land a client that would make the Caldwells eat their words. It sounded petty. It was. But it was also purpose. I stopped apologizing for needing to win. In my second month in Portland, I applied for a design contract with a startup that was making headlines in sustainable packaging. A week later, I got the call: I had the job. And their primary investor, Caldwell Ventures. When I saw the name on the client list, I laughed so hard I cried. I could have backed out, sure, but I didn't. This was not coincidence. This was karma on a silver platter. I accepted the contract with a smile and started building the presentation of my life. Not just to impress, to dominate. I was done hiding, done surviving. This was my return, but not to them, to myself. If they had paid attention, they would have seen it coming. But they never did. Because they were too busy laughing, too busy underestimating the girl they thought would disappear quietly. I would not just return, I would rise. Not as someone's wife, not as a disappointment, not as a footnote. As Stella, fully formed, unapologetically driven, and finally in control. The moment I stepped into the sleek glass conference room on the 42nd floor of the McLaren building, I knew this was not just a meeting, it was a reckoning. My name badge read Stella Whitmore, lead designer, and it felt like armor. The receptionist offered me lemon water and a chair with a view of the skyline. A man from marketing complimented my portfolio. No one here knew I had once served hors d'oeuvres to guests like them in my ex-mother-in-law's manicured backyard. No one cared about where I came from, only what I could do. And I was ready to show them. When the project lead walked in and laid out the scope of the campaign, I noticed the logo stamped in the corner of every slide: Caldwell Ventures. I did not flinch. I smiled. I'm familiar with the brand, I said. That afternoon, I pitched the most daring concept I had ever created: a bold, minimalist rebrand that stripped the legacy baggage and replaced it with clarity, sustainability, and story. The room was dead silent when I finished. Then came the applause. Not polite, not obligatory, genuine. They signed off on it in less than 48 hours. 3 days later, I received an invitation to present the campaign at a private investor gala hosted by Caldwell Ventures. I stared at the screen. I could decline stay in Portland, cash the check, and disappear. But that would be playing small again. And I was done with that. So I RSVP'd, yes, ordered a tailored navy jumpsuit that hugged me in all the right places, and booked a flight back into the heart of their empire. When I arrived at the venue, a luxury hotel that had once hosted Elias and Claire's joint birthday party, I was met with a familiar chill in the air. People turned to look, some with curiosity, some with recognition. And then I saw them. Claire at the bar, her expression half bored, half bitter. Patricia near the fireplace, surrounded by donors. And Elias, flanked by investors, laughing a little too loud. He turned. His eyes met mine. For a moment, the entire room seemed to still. I did not smile. I did not look away. I walked right past them, up to the podium, and gave a keynote that silenced every room I had ever been ignored in. When it was over, people stood. Claire blinked in disbelief. Patricia looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Elias just stood there small, in a way I had never seen before. I left before dessert coat over my shoulder, head held high. In the elevator down, I checked my phone, 4 missed calls from an unknown number. I already knew who it was. Let him wonder. Let them all wonder. I was no longer the woman they had dismissed at that backyard table. I was the one who walked away and returned not begging, but blazing. And this time, they were the ones left speechless. I woke up the next morning in my Portland apartment to an inbox flooded with messages. Incredible keynote. Your work is game-changing. Are you open to new contracts? But one email stood out not because it was eloquent, but because it was desperate. The subject line, "Please call me." The sender, Elias Caldwell. I stared at it for a long time. I knew what it was, an attempt to reclaim something he thought still belonged to him. Control. Nostalgia. Or maybe just an image to salvage for his ego. I deleted it without opening it. But he did not stop. By the end of the week, I had 5 voicemails, 3 texts, and a handwritten letter delivered to my office door. It was pathetic. In the letter, he wrote that seeing me at the gala woke something up in him, that he never should have let me go, that Claire had always been misunderstood, and that maybe there was still something between us. That line made me laugh. Still something, no Elias. What we had was buried, not dormant. And Claire misunderstood was a generous rewrite of history. I tucked the letter into a drawer, not to reread, but to remind myself how far I had come. But the storm did not stop with Elias. Claire messaged me on LinkedIn 2 days later, all fake sweetness and vague apologies. "You really made an impression," she wrote. "We should grab coffee sometime and catch up like sisters." I nearly dropped my phone from laughing. The same woman who once made fun of my thrift store shoes now wanted to split a latte and play pretend. But Claire did not stop there. When I ignored her, she left a voicemail. "Listen," she said, "I know I said things I shouldn't have, but you got your revenge right. You've made your point. So can we move past it now, as if the pain she caused was some competition, and now that I had won, we were even." It was the entitlement in her voice that burned the most, like her forgiveness was the favor. That was when I decided it was time to go public. I did not name names, but I wrote an op-ed in a design magazine titled "Erased at the Table: How Class Still Silences Talent." I shared my story, edited, professional but cutting. I talked about being dismissed, minimized, and mocked, about how power plays out in casual cruelty, and about how I built a life, not despite that pain, but through it. The piece went viral. I received hundreds of messages from women designers, engineers, teachers who had lived the same silent erasure. Claire read it, Patricia read it, Elias definitely read it, and none of them said a word. Because there is no comeback when the truth is louder than their excuses. That was my real revenge, not their embarrassment, but my visibility. The version of me they tried to suppress had now become a voice for others, and nothing terrified them more than that. The article changed everything, not just for me, but for the entire conversation around class respect and invisibility in elite spaces. It was shared on social media by CEOs, feminist platforms, even a few celebrities. One interviewer called it a battle cry for the underestimated. But while the public celebrated, the people who had once silenced me reacted very differently. Elias went radio silent again. I imagined him reading the article, in his corner office, jaw clenched, wondering how the woman he used to ignore over breakfast was now shaping public opinion. Claire, however, did not take the silence route. She messaged me again, this time angrier. "You could have destroyed our family name," she wrote. "You're lucky we are not suing for defamation." I responded with just 3 words. "Truth is untouchable." And I meant it. Because for once, my words were not confined to whispered pleas in a kitchen while someone else talked over me. They were broadcast printed and unedited. They were mine. The op-ed also opened doors I never imagined. Invitations to speak at women's leadership summits, offers to consult with major companies on inclusive branding, and a publishing house that wanted a memoir. But amidst all the noise, something quieter arrived, a handwritten letter in a pale blue envelope. It was from Elias's Aunt Lorraine. We had only spoken a handful of times over the years, but she always seemed different, softer. I read your piece, the letter began. And I want you to know I always saw you. They tried to dim you because you lit up everything they were afraid to see in themselves. I read that sentence over and over. For every cold stare and passive dig I had endured, those words healed something raw. But nothing prepared me for what came next. A week later, I received an invitation to consult on the rebranding of one of Caldwell Ventures' struggling subsidiaries. Yes, that Caldwell Ventures. The same one whose name was stamped on my humiliation. They were bleeding clients, losing relevance, and desperate to modernize. The irony was so sharp it nearly made me dizzy. At first, I thought it was a prank. But the email was real. And the executive who sent it, a woman. A woman who had read my article, followed my work, and wanted to bring in someone unapologetically bold. I did not say yes right away. I thought about what it would mean to walk back into the belly of the beast, this time on my terms. But I also knew this was not about vengeance anymore. It was about visibility impact and rewriting narratives. So I said yes. Not for them. For me. And maybe, just maybe, for every Stella who had ever been told she was not enough. As I walked into their headquarters, weeks later, clipboard in hand and team at my side, no one whispered. No one laughed. They watched. They listened. Because now I was not there for approval. I was there to lead. And this time, they knew better than to underestimate the woman they once called invisible. The elevator ride to the 38th floor was silent, but inside me a storm churned. I had agreed to the contract. I had brought my team. I had rehearsed my pitch. But nothing prepared me for stepping back into the building that once represented everything I was told I would never be a Caldwell. The difference was, this time, I walked in not as someone's wife, not as a tolerated accessory, but as the lead consultant. They had called me. They needed me. And that fact alone was delicious. The receptionist, a young woman with anxious eyes, greeted me with a stammer. They're waiting for you in the West boardroom, Ms. Whitmore. I gave her a gentle smile. Thank you. I still remembered being the woman who waited outside those rooms while the real decisions happened behind closed doors. Now I was the one they waited for. When I opened the glass door, the room fell quiet. Seated around the polished mahogany table were several senior executives, and at the head Elias. He looked older, tired, and startled. For a moment, our eyes locked. He did not smile. He did not speak. Claire sat beside him, eyes wide and fake composure cracking by the second. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if unsure how to greet the woman she had once told to disappear. I placed my portfolio binder on the table and began the presentation. My voice was steady, crisp. I walked them through every slide market data brand identity campaign, flow, all framed around one unshakable principle. Authentic transformation requires acknowledgement of what was broken. I watched Claire flinch when I said it. I watched Elias's jaw tighten when I referenced inclusive leadership and female-forward branding. And I felt nothing but calm. When the presentation ended, the room erupted in polite applause, except from the two people who used to control every conversation I was excluded from. The Q&A came and went, and then, as the room emptied, Elias lingered. Stella, he said quiet, you were always meant for more. I just never saw it until now. I nodded once. No, you saw it. You just hoped I never would. I left him standing there, holding his regret like a briefcase full of missed chances. As for Claire, she caught me outside the restroom. You proved your point, she said. We get it. You're the success story now. I looked her straight in the eyes. This was never about proving a point. It was about reclaiming mine. That night, back in my apartment, I poured a glass of red wine and stood on my balcony. The city glowed. I had not just returned to the empire that tried to erase me, I had reshaped it. And while their faces haunted no more, their lessons remained. Power was not in their name. It had always been in mine. And now, finally, they knew it too. I did not expect the press to catch wind of the deal. But within days of my re-entry into Caldwell Ventures as lead branding consultant, the narrative exploded across business blogs and industry columns. Ex-Caldwell daughter-in-law leads brand revival, from outsider to architect of change, revenge and power heels. At first I cringed at the word revenge. That was never the plan, not exactly. But it was undeniable that the image of me, once the silenced wife, now the face of their reinvention, sparked something raw and electrifying in the public imagination. Emails poured in from strangers, women who had been laughed out of boardrooms, men who had lost years to silence people who had seen themselves erased by families, companies, or both. And while I knew some stories were darker than mine, the core was the same: someone made them feel like less, and they survived anyway. My name became a quiet anthem for resilience. And with that came weight. At a follow-up strategy meeting, I walked in to find a gift basket at my seat. A card inside read, "From enemies to allies," signed by Claire. The basket was filled with skincare, a candle labeled peace, and bizarrely a notebook titled "Let It Go." I actually laughed. Claire's version of apology was as performative as her cruelty had once been cutting. I left the basket in the hallway. Let someone else take the bath bomb. I did not need false closure packaged in lavender. But it was not just Claire trying to rewrite the past. Patricia called. Twice. Left voicemails. "We may not have seen eye to eye," she said, "but you were always passionate." It almost sounded like respect until I replayed the tone. She was not sorry. She was afraid. Afraid that her tightly controlled legacy was now associated with the girl they once mocked for being ordinary. I never returned her calls. Then came the gala again. A year after the one where I stunned them into silence, Caldwell Ventures planned a press-covered anniversary celebration. I was listed as a guest of honor. The irony was thick enough to drown in. But I went. Not out of vanity, out of closure. I wore a crimson gown, walked in with a female CEO I had mentored, and took every photo with grace. Elias tried to talk to me that night. He asked if we could ever start again. I looked at him, really looked. "You never knew how to hold me when I was small," I said. "You do not deserve to hold me now that I am big." He nodded. Maybe for the first time in his life, he understood something without needing it explained twice. I stepped outside before midnight, the city buzzing below champagne still chilled in my hand. The lights shimmered, and I realized I had not just rewritten my story. I had rewritten theirs too. They would forever be a footnote in my rise, and I was more than willing to let them stay there. Quiet, small, forgotten, just like they once tried to make me. After the gala, something inside me finally settled. Not the kind of relief that comes from forgiveness. No, that was never what I came for. But the kind that blooms when you stop carrying other people's shame on your back. I had spent years trying to be enough for a family that was never even worthy of me. And now, standing tall in rooms that once made me feel small, I could see it all so clearly. I was never the failure in that story. I was the miscast hero waiting for her rewrite. In the weeks following the event, more invitations rolled in: speaking engagements, think tanks, consulting offers from names I had once whispered with awe. But instead of saying yes to everything, I paused. For once, I wanted silence by choice, not by suppression. I spent a weekend alone in Cannon Beach, walking barefoot on the shore, letting the wind rip through the remnants of who I had been. One evening, sitting with a glass of wine and my laptop open, I began writing a letter, not to Elias, not to Claire, not even to Patricia, but to the version of Stella who had once stood silently beside a grill humiliated. I wrote, "You did not vanish. You endured. And one day, you walked away not because you were weak, but because you finally knew you were worth more than crumbs from anyone's table." That version of me had waited years to be validated. she would not wait any longer. When I returned to Portland, I decided to start something new, a mentoring collective for women who had been excluded, underestimated, and silenced in creative industries. We called it Frame for Resilience, Artistry, Momentum, and Equity. Within months, we had a network of over 200 women sharing contracts, advocating for pay transparency, and lifting each other out of the trenches we had been shoved into. One of the members, a shy designer named Ria, told me, "You made me believe I could take up space." That one sentence undid 100 wounds. That was the real legacy, not proving something to the Caldwells, but proving to women like Ria and the Stella I used to be that survival was only the beginning. As for the Caldwells, they faded into the background. Their names still rang out in boardrooms, but the weight had shifted. Their empire was no longer untouchable. It had been shaped in part by the very woman they tried to erase, that irony that poetic justice would always live in the foundation of their brand. Some stories end in forgiveness. Mine did not. Mine ended in freedom earned fierce and unapologetically mine. If you have ever been silenced, underestimated, or erased, tell your story in the comments. And if Stella's journey stirred something in you, like and subscribe. Because stories like these are not just told, they are lived. And you deserve to be heard. Say in